I found that incredibly interesting, and so I was wondering, to come to the question, first of all, how much of that cinema, I know your background has been, you've been raised also in Europe, so how much of all those experiences of cinema in the end of the 60s in Latin America and Italian cinema you incorporated in your own films, and how much European cinema there is in your film, and if you think, this is a separate language, separate question, if you think that that language that Latin American film cinema found is still present, or if it has lost its way a little bit in the imitation of other cinemas again, maybe not Antonioni, but American cinema or other cinemas.
Well, first of all, I think that when Rossellini and De Sica and all of the great Italian filmmakers of the neorealism movement took out the camera from the studio and brought it to the streets, it really incorporated a human geography and stories that were absent were not reflected on the screen for so long. And this ultimately was a revolution that had affected other filmmaking, other filmic movements around the globe. The Brazilian Cinema Novo is really the point of encounter between the Italian neorealism and, for instance, Eisenstein. If you look at Godard, if you look at Glauber Rocha, for instance, it's that. But if you look at Nelson Pereira dos Santos, he is in a closer vein to the Italian neorealism, and same for the new cinema in Cuba in 64, 65. A lot of those filmmakers were actually trained in Italy as well. So Tomás Gutierrez Alea was at the Lucci Institute together with Antonioni. They were in the same class. So there are common grounds that there are common intersections that had a trigger effect throughout the globe, and I think it affected our generation of filmmakers pretty much. And it's not by accident that Brazilian cinema is strongest, I think, when it is at the frontier of fiction and documentary. That did affect me a lot as a young, as a 12-year-old kid or 15-year-old kid. When I went to the movies, I lived in France at that time, and I hated the cold, I hated croissants, but I loved the cinema. I was saved by cinemas, to see films was really extraordinary, and that effect is still pretty much present. I think that the beginning of this film has a lot to do with that, that movement. And actually, I have to say that in introducing the film, I said that we had, after 5 years of silence, we had the desire to bring stories back to the screen. And interestingly, those stories came to the film pretty much in an uncontrolled manner. So the screenplay was very, we had worked many times on the screenplay. We got to the 20th version of the screenplay of this film. And strangely, since the very first day, we lost control of the story in a good manner. Because this is obviously a pre-digital world. There's no phones, nobody's taking selfies or anything. And what happened is that as we laid the setting for Fernando Montenegro to write letters, people lined up to write letters, actually. And we worked a lot with a hidden camera in the central station. There's a large percentage of shots that are, you know, taken from what truly happened. So the very first person who talks in the film is the woman who was in prison and who wrote a letter to that sculpture I talked about. I had no idea what she was going to say, and what she brought up was something that was truly part of her life, you know.
And she was able to get out of prison, you were saying?
She was allowed to come for a few days to do this, and then she got back to serve for 6 more months, which was quite unique and a gesture, I have to say. But very unlikely in Brazil to have that. And then the people who come after her, I think that at least 50% are unscripted letters. And what you have to realize also is that Fernanda Montenegro, she had done 6 films up to that time. So, and very little television. So she was not a very well-known star.
Like today,
she was a very respected, our first lady in the theater and so forth, but she was not that much of a public figure. And images didn't circulate nearly as much as they circulate today. So we were able to move within the station where 800,000 people go back and forth every single day, and we really were on the fringe of keeping control and losing control throughout the whole film.
But that's something else that I found very interesting that you were saying earlier. We were discussing how for a filmmaker it's always about the urge and the desire to make a film, and how that desire is kept alive, how that desire is transferred in the experience of making a film. And so Walter was saying that he felt that you said that you feel like cinema really happens and begins in the moment that you feel like you're collectively, you and your crew lose the awareness that you are making a film. So that you need to structure things in a way that then allows yourself and your crew to get lost in something that's happening. And you said to me, I'm really against the behind the scenes, the making of, shooting making of, because it sort of kills that, makes it really rational. So how does that happen? When do you feel you're getting lost in that experience? How does that happen that the crew and people that work with you forget that? And I'm very interested in the sense that you said collectively, because, you know, as we experience very much here, us as an audience really rejoice when we collectively experience a film, and so I'm really interested in this aspect.
So I'll give you an example. You know, in doing the research for the locations, we realized that the path that we had chosen was, by coincidence, a path that was taken by pilgrims, and that was not in the screenplay to start with. So that the whole religious passage was not part of the earlier versions of the screenplay. And so we incorporated that, but then we were faced with the big question is how to enact that, because it's so peculiar and it has an inner time that is so depending on a motion that is not the motion of cinema, where you have to stop many times, you know, to change the camera and go from one place to another. And we laid tracks before the 800 people that came to be part of that pilgrimage scene arrived, and we didn't rehearse anything. And then at the beginning, when the scene started to emerge, it emerged and it took an inner rhythm that was not our rhythm, or at least a normal rhythm of cinema. It just went from one situation to another and another and another, and people started to, how do you say, to do things like, you know, there's a scene where somebody has a stone in the head, and talk and ask and declamate. Nothing that was scripted, you know, and the only way to actually grab that was to work with two cameras. Walter Salles was an incredible DP who worked with me many times as a documentary filmmaker. Went in one direction, I went in another direction, and everything is take one, is in one go in that sequence, until they reached the house where we could work more. But the way we did that was to be completely in synchronicity with what was being, the reenactment became the thing itself, if you want to. And we actually were just part of that, as opposed to be doing a film about that. You see, so when there's a sense of transit, how do you say that? Transit. When you actually forget that you're collectively doing cinema, I think this is really when cinema erupts. You're just in complete synchronicity doing that specific scene, and I constantly search for that, and obviously it doesn't happen all the time. So you know, there are films that I've done that I'm not happy with because I couldn't find that kind of unique sensorial quality, you know, that sometimes erupts. Of course, within the scene, if you're working on a scene that's in a controlled environment, in a location, you can always try to find that freshness by, for instance, altering lines, eliminating lines, asking for one actor to do something that other actors don't know, and actually the scene will become much fresher than it was before. So I think that cinema is about not allowing things to become stale.
That's why you like journeys and road movies so much.
Well, they are so unpredictable that you either go with the flow or you become, I think, very much behind. You lose the sense of the film, you know. But for that, you have to be in a filmic environment that allows you to do that. Yes, I was telling you a story about Motorcycle Diaries. When we arrived in Patagonia, it was the first day of summer, and as it arrived, it started to snow. And it was a Sunday, which is a day off, of course, almost everywhere in the filmic world. And we asked how long that snow was going to last. It was going to last one day, you know. So I said, okay, who wants to film? And of course the actors wanted to film, and we grabbed a crew of 8. And there are 8 minutes in the film about on that Sunday, you know, in which everything is on take one, everything is reacted to that. But if in the script it says Patagonia, beautiful sunny day, da 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 da, you have to wait for Monday. Which I find a terrible thing to do if you're doing a road movie. You have to actually know that you're infinitely small in regards to the elements, and try to abide by what is given to you and work with the elements.
So where you're putting yourself in a situation where you are challenged and surprised, and you in a very aware, rational way, put yourself in a situation where you have everything controlled, but you want to be challenged by something unexpected. Is that right?
Yes, but I think that you can only do that if the script is interestingly or paradoxically structured enough to allow you to abandon it, because you can find it again. You know, it's a little bit like jazz. If there's I was telling you that if if there's a melody, you know, you can always completely bifurcate from that, from it, and then find that melody again, you know. And in the sense that improvisation is already in the line of the film. The improvisation becomes organic with the film, so that when Fernanda Montenegro is creating lines or reacting to the people who are dictating letters, she has no idea what they can. She already does that in very much in character, and that takes weeks of preparation, and you have to be extremely prepared if you want to improvise. I believe that these things are interdependent.
And I believe the work you've done with Josué, with the characters, is also. I wonder sometimes, you know, we're gonna see Bicycle Thieves tomorrow night, so we were thinking Bicycle Thieves would probably not exist without, I don't know, Chaplin, and probably in lots of films, probably this film, this kind of child would probably not exist without Bicycle Thieves. We saw Pisciocchi yesterday, and I know that there's been, when Central do Brasil came out, there was a lot of references to Pisciocchi, in the sense that Pisciocchi is really a film, obviously shot in a very different historical time period. As we were saying yesterday, we're still with the dictatorship, and clearly it's a childhood that has no hope. It's a completely bleak and hopeless and harsh sense of society that takes this innocence and destroys it, and it just leaves no hope. And this is, in a way, I'm not inventing anything, it's been written extensively, it's a way to reconciliate the idea of this childhood through a quest, through a journey, through finding, you know, sort of human geography, and through this journey find the chance, at least the possibility of regaining that kind of innocence.
You know, I think that, well, first of all, for Pisciocchi, it's difficult to compare anything to that film, because it's such a unique masterwork, you know, that I feel very shy even to talk about it. in the sense that I have a hard time actually connecting Pisciocchi to anything that came before or after it, because I think it's such an original and extraordinary vision of Babenco, really. And seeing the film, you lose yourself in it, you know, in the most beautiful sense, and at the same time, until yesterday night, when I saw the film in the morning, I was still with the film and shattered by it, you know. How many times does cinema allow you to go through that kind of experience, you know, very, very seldomly. So getting back here in this specific moment of time, you know, when you go through that longer period of lack of democracy, and when there was so much time also where films cannot be done. What was more urgent to me was to listen. In Portuguese, I would say não dito, to listen to what hadn't been said for too long, and what hadn't been seen for too long, if you want to. And this is how that character of Josué came about. And in fact, the search for the father is also the search for the country itself. You know, in Portuguese, only a letter separates the word father from the word from the word country.
What are those?
Father is pai, and country is país. So in fact, the journey for the father for me was always the journey inland, a country that we hadn't seen for a long, long time. And after 25 years of despair, you want to allow for some hope to stick in, you know. So I think that we were all in that movement in the 90s called the Retomada, the renewal of Brazilian cinema, somehow, you know, trying to convey that. So the film is pretty much about a question of resensibilization. Does the word exist?
We'll accept it as if it
okay,
existed.
I don't know. Resensibilização. And it's really about the regain of identity as opposed to the loss of identity. And the film is structured in that since the very beginning. So you realize that in the central station, for instance, there is always very little depth of focus, and it's you have a sense that the characters are completely lonely and by themselves within that you know, those crowds, and there are more than 100 layers actually of sound. It's very cacophonic, and as the film gets closer to the hypothetical father and daughter that Fernanda Montenegro portrays, starts to understand that the world is larger than she thought, and then slowly you gain depth of focus. Slowly you gain colors that we eliminated in Rio. It's really in browns and grays. There's no beach. There's no part of the touristy Rio in there. And as the blues started to enter, there's a process of understanding that the world is larger than she thought of, and that we thought of. And at the same time, this question of regaining identity goes in the opposite direction in the sound. So at the very end, you can hear that what wakes up the kid is just the echo of a dog barking. So it's just one element. And so the whole film goes towards the idea of regaining identity as opposed to the identity lost during all those years, you know. So it's all structured in that way, and of course it's something that we thought about, and hopefully people didn't see, but it's what allows the film to progress in the direction it progresses.
Absolutely. Any question now, or should I go ahead? I have endless questions, so if you do have.
Yes, hello. So it was a beautiful restoration. I was happy to see again this movie, probably 20 years now.
Yes.
And about those 20 years, do you have, what would be your vision now? We know that Brazil is not going well at all now, and I don't know, would you have another vision, another way to show things today?
Yes, probably if I was going to... I'm actually preparing a screenplay now on this, but it's too early to say about it, either to verbalize it. But I would say that I would probably film something that would be much closer to foreign land today. You know, the film I had done before this one, because I think that we are pretty much at the same crossroads, in the sense that we're confronting really, it's even the very essence of democracy is being confronted now in Brazil. Is questioned now in Brazil, and this has been the worst times on an economic, social, cultural point in more than 20 years. So if I was going to do a film now, I would have to obviously respond to that, in the sense that, again, you know, cinema being the reflection of what you're perceiving at the specific moment in time, it would go in this direction. I also have to say that reality is moving so fast in Brazil now that I had 2 or 3 screenplays that I worked on, and that became somehow ultrapassados. So you say that the reality went further than I had expected, and I had to divert into another direction and then write something else, actually. It's not a very easy time to do fiction in Brazil, in this sense. It's a very inviting time to do documentaries.
When you say things are going too fast, what do you refer? Sorry, what do you refer to? You mean the political?
I would say that the loss in all democratic fronts is going so rapidly that many things that you thought would never happen are happening. So you have to somehow confront that, and obviously it's, you know, in cinema, to foresee is quite important, as in many other things in life.
It's like dystopia is.
And you have to actually limit. You have to think of where it could go to be on the exact same time, and you know, and it's very difficult to do this. It's a very difficult time to actually grab the reality in Brazil, I think.
Any other question? So you are clearly one of those really cinephilic filmmakers. As you very well know, not all filmmakers enjoy watching cinema from all, you know, time periods and all countries like you do. Is still today that a big part of your say daily experience of your life, or was that through more at the beginning of your career? Like how much weight does cinema as a fruiter of cinema has to these days in your life?
It's still very much at the center, and I, you know, I think that if you lose the interest in watching a film collectively, something about the desire to do film dims, you know. So I'm still one of those people that go to see 2 or 3 films a week, and in the cinema. So I continue to like that, and at the same time I have younger children like you do. So it's been a pleasure to see. Actually, interestingly, we showed 7 Chances by Buster Keaton the other day to my children. They loved it, and I never thought that they would, you know, and they loved it. As Miyazaki's work, and it's such a pleasure to rediscover also, you know, and that of course is in video or Blu-ray, for that, I think that Truffaut was right. He used to say that cinema is to be discovered in the cinema, but then the DVD or the Blu-ray allow you to revive or to revisit, what you once fell in love with. And there are films. You mentioned Alea's film. Maybe I watched it 10 times on the restored.
It was thanks to you that we restored it.
But,
We didn't know how
thanks to you that it was
bad
restored.
it was. Yes.
And it's always something to discover in rewatching films as well. And I still feel that that there's something incredibly uma potência. How do you say that? There's something absolutely powerful in the cinematic experience that you don't have in the other forms of communication that became trivial today. First, you don't have to like or dislike the film. You can like it and not like it, at the same time. The second thing is the possibility to discuss. Sometimes I go alone, but many times I go with 2 or 3 friends or my wife, and obviously that becomes part of the weekly conversation, and it's still very impactful if I compare it to the other possibilities that you have also of accessing images. I don't know if my sons are going to feel that about cinema, but I was saying that I'm still very much in love with it and not nostalgic about what it was, and the Cinema Ritrovato is a proof of that also. When you put 7,000 people in the piazza and they're watching the same film from the 30s that they probably very few people know, who did that film. It's really about the faith of cinema, the faith that you need to. I think that kind of faith goes both ways. Goes when you do a film, but also when you watch a film. You have that. Anyway, this is one of the places that truly invigorates you. So I'm the one who has to.
Thank you.
Say grazie.
See why we want to clone him, of course. So, but when Martin Scorsese was here last week, so we were brainstorming before he had a conversation at the Opera House with 4 prominent Italian filmmakers, with Matteo Garrone, Valeria Golino, who's been an actress for many years, but now she's actually making films. Alice Rohrwacher, who's cinema is very close to Olmi, is very close to the land, is very close to a certain Italian tradition. And Jonas Carpignano, who's very young, but I don't know if you saw A Ciambra, but it's quite extraordinary. So we met a little beforehand with him to discuss a little bit, not to tell him the questions. He didn't want to know the questions, but we just had a conversation, a pre-conversation. So obviously he was, one of the things that came out is that he's 2 of his films are currently produced by Netflix. The Irishman that is about that is actually editing right now, and a new documentary that is making as well. They're produced by Netflix. So Matteo Garrone, who was in competition in Cannes, and I think Dogman is a wonderful film, and it did well in Italy in theaters, but maybe not as well as it was expected to, simply because figures are dropping dramatically in theaters in this country. So he's not disappointed, but I mean he's struggling a little bit to figure out what the future is going to be, and he had trouble, because of that he's having trouble selling the films everywhere as others were expecting. So the question obviously revolved around the fact that a filmmaker like Scorsese was one of the major advocates of cinemas, and this collective experience you're talking about, and print and preserving and everything, as a film is being produced by Netflix, that probably, thanks to trying to bend all the Netflix rules, is going to be in theaters for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it will have a release in theaters, but really short. So, and he said something interesting, because that was kind of a question. They very different generation of filmmakers. So he was basically saying, I'm 75, I want to make films. I need to make films. I need to make my films. The studios, they don't have money anymore. So I want to make my films. I'm gonna go with those who have the money to make film, because I'm 75 and I'm done my fights. I fought a lot for everything, and now it's up to you to figure out your fights, to figure out how, what's gonna happen as a reaction of that, what's gonna happen as a reaction of film now, of Amazon and Netflix being today's producers. It's up to you to figure out what's the response that you need to, how do you need to respond to this situation, how do you need to ensure that this collective experience is kept alive. He didn't say it with these words, mind you, but he was like, I've really done my share now, I really need to think about the fact that I need to make films, and I'm gonna go with whoever I happen to, not whoever, but I mean, those are today's new studios, so it's up to you. And so we know, as we were talking earlier, cinema has been so related to technology, so inherently related to technology, that cinema reacted to what happened when television came about, with the formats, so there's always a response and a reaction. So do you feel we are in that moment where something else is about to respond to that? Do you feel we are, because we tend to be, as you said, very nostalgic about it. Do you feel we are now seeing something that is about to happen that's going to respond to that? Or you feel we really are on the brink of losing something that's really important to us?
It's a really good question, and actually I was thinking about the Cahiers du Cinéma that did the whole number on this. So and it was an extraordinary number. What can cinema still do? It was the title. Que peut encore le cinéma, I think. And in that, in there were maybe 15 or 20 people writing, and their perception was very different one from another, And I think that happens when you're confronted with what a friend of mine called the adolescence of a new technology. We're really in a time where the technology is in transition, and obviously it becomes a very difficult how do you say, very difficult. It's very difficult to predict what's going to come. I fully understand Scorsese's position, because when you have the urge to do a film, you have to do a film. By the way, you should only do a film when you have the urge to do a film. So if he has that urge,
he certainly does.
It's wonderful wherever it's going to be, And inevitably we will come to a point where we will watch films in a different manner. We have done that through centuries. If you think about, there's one thing that will never die, which is the need to show a reflection of the times we live in, wherever it is. I mean, it took for the first light to come in, for the cavemen to draw the Lascaux, paintings. Theater, how many times did we hear that it was going to die? You know, when photography came, we you know, many people thought that was the end of painting, and yet it freed painting to go into abstract expressionism and, you know, so many different directions. What will be cinema ahead, I don't know, but one thing I am pretty sure of, it's not going to resume itself to only that kind of homogenized production where you see the multiplication of I have a big trouble with television these days, where you go from channel to channel. It happens in Brazil, but it happens here as well. Most of the time you see the replication of formulas, you know, that go all the time, and the exceptions are still in cinema. You see, when something bubbles with and comes out of the norm, it comes in cinema. And we were talking yesterday about Patterson from Jim Jarmusch. It was produced by Amazon. It's one of the most beautiful films I've seen last year. You know, it just changes the nature of how we see it. Maybe there is something that will alter drastically how we make the films, but as long as they can be autorais, as long as they can relay a vision that is particular and unique on our world, I think that it will survive.
You mentioned yesterday about Patterson. You said that you wrote a letter to Jim Jarmusch's assistant, and he replied to you directly because he feels he's missing that direct feedback from his neighborhood. You were saying.
Well, that is a sign of times, but will it last? We don't know. You know, will it come to a moment where you know, the access of a film like Patterson will be multiplied by 100, and much more people will watch your film? I don't know. I have an example to give to you. Did a documentary on Jia Zhangke, the Chinese filmmaker, and you know, his first 3 films were censored, and he therefore could not reach the cinemas. His work for 6-7 years didn't reach the cinemas, but somebody grabbed a copy of it and made piracy. And this is when he realized that his first film and his second film had been seen by hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of people. I'm not advocating for piracy here, but there was an array of people who had seen the film, and he said, you know, everybody comes to me and talks about the film, and I have cousins all over China, and I had no idea that this was happening. You know, there he was in the Shanxi province doing those films, the very north part of China, and somehow through technology that, you know, dispersed itself, and it changed completely, you know, his position within the film world. And it was quite funny that that conversation happened in the Mostra de São Paulo, the São Paulo Film Festival, and at the end he thanked me by giving me a pirate copy of Central Station, which, by the way, had a much better cover than ours in you know, in Brazil, in France. The cover was much better. And the quality also of the image was fantastic. So I highly recommend. I just want to see, you had such a graceful position to see the film twice in the beginning today that if you want to see the Chinese version, I highly recommend the Jiazhangke one.
So we have one last question. Do you have a question?
Thank you so much. I was wondering, I was hesitant to raise this question, but from the Cahiers du Cinema title, What Can Cinema Still Do? Watching this film today, I was in tears. I think also because of what's happening with, what has been happening politically with the refugee crisis, and also in the country I live in, the United States, with children and separation from their families, and so I'm wondering, the question, what can cinema still do? Sometimes it feels so helpless when you hear that, politics are changing so quickly, and, as you said, in Brazil, but also in the United States. Yesterday was an announcement of the retirement of Supreme Court Justice, and it's really kind of scary. I was wondering if you could talk about more.
No, I agree. Even on a larger scale, I think that even the concept of democracy itself is being challenged on so many latitudes. From Russia to United States to Brazil, we're seeing a complete reversal in what we used to call democratic societies. And, film since the very beginnings, it truly existed based on a specific understanding of the world and a desire to reflect that one world. So I think there's something inherently uniquely potent about cinema still, and potentially radical about cinema, that of course you don't have when you go through gatekeepers such as large film producing companies, studios, or even Netflix or Amazon. There's something in Jiazhangke's early films, as I was saying, that is that goes drastically against what was allowed to be seen as film in China at that specific moment. So there's something. If cinema is to survive, it has to do with its subversive potential. Still, cinema in all its forms, either documentary or fiction. So in this, I have I keep that faith in cinema, and I still think that it's a unique form to give to relay a precise understanding of that society, of a specific society in time. And maybe someone is grabbing a camera in the United States and doing something like what you just mentioned. In Brazil now, we went through an impeachment process that was completely manipulated from the start, and there are 4 documentaries that were shot at the same time, 4 or 5, I don't know, several. One Guta's already is in the cinema, but films have been shot allowing yourself to see things that you didn't see on television for a long time. So the media allows a much larger freedom is not the word, it's more than that.
Dissemination.
Dissemination, yes, than any other controlled form of relaying images. So in this sense, I'm optimistic about the future of cinema, also because anyone can grab a camera and shoot something that you thought that was not being seen, you know. Yesterday after Pichacci was screened, Roberto Gervitz, fellow friend and filmmaker, showed the documentary on the screenwriter Georges Dourin. It was really beautiful 15 minutes documentary, and it was shot with an iPhone. And I didn't realize it. You know, so the technology is on one point against cinema in the fact that it has there's been a process of homogenization of images, but on the other hand, you know, there are many more potential voices out there that can grab a camera and maybe film something in the making that would not be filmed in other forms. You were talking to me about, you know, the documentaries this year, and Jean-Michel Frodon, I'm sorry, was.
I like to be mistaken by.
No, but that's because you both are such cinephiles. He was talking to me about the documentaries that he saw in Cannes this year, and he said they were quite extraordinary, and blending sometimes the documentary film form with animation. When something couldn't be revived, something was animated, and he said it's something that we couldn't have been done, you know, long ago, and these are completely independent filmmakers doing that. So of course the question is how to disseminate that, how can it reach all of us, and people who are not lucky to be at the Cinema Ritrovato. You know, that's the main problem. In fact, is how do you know that something is truly out there and deserves your time? That's the main question.
Well, I think we could stay here for another 3-4 hours talking. Thank you so much. This was really a gift, and I think we're really looking forward to watching your next film as well.
Thank you so much. Can I just thank the audience and say, tell a little story about Fernando Montenegro?
Please, absolutely.
When we were in the process of releasing Central do Brasil in different countries, we went to a country where the film was shown dubbed, you know, and nobody knew in the crew. I didn't know, Fernanda didn't know, and we were there at the premiere, and then when it started, she realized it was dubbed, and I did too, and we somehow survived the moment, but there was a entonação, how you said that, the interpretation of the lady you know, who was doing Fernanda was very mellow, much too mellow, you know, and it of course affected her, and she said, "Oh no, you know, this is not at all what should have been done." And from there we went to Germany, and I said, "Oh please, I hope that the film will not be dubbed now." And it started to screen, and it was dubbed, and the first sentence when she when at that specific point, there's a moment where she says, "Josué, do this," and it goes, "Josué, schnell," and she said, "Ah, okay, this woman got it, you know, that's fine." So that's I had a previous experience with films that were dubbed, and thank you very much for, again, your generosity and patience, and especially to you. Thank you so much. Thank you.